Subscribe to Dust and Devotion Tales. New stories every day. Don't miss out. The town of Red Hollow lay along a dry riverbed in northern New Mexico in the early spring of 1901. Dust rose with every step, curling into the corners of weathered wooden buildings, settling on porches and wagon wheels alike. The land demanded patience and endurance, and those who had lived there learned to read silence as carefully as the sky. Daniel Mercer had arrived months before, riding a weary horse along the rutted trail from a town long behind him. He had no history here and intended to keep it that way. His days were spent repairing farm equipment and maintaining fences on the outskirts of Red Hollow. He spoke little, listened constantly, and avoided leaving traces that might draw questions about his past. The calm of the town changed when a rider appeared over the mesa, heading toward the edge of Red Hollow with a quiet determination. She was Clara Wren, a woman of no renown, riding a small bay horse that had carried her from a distant town. She had inherited an abandoned inn just off the main trail, a building that leaned into the wind and bore the scars of years without care. Its boards creaked under her hand as she inspected the structure, its windows broken and doorways rattling. Clara did not wait for assistance. She dismounted, tied her horse, and began work immediately, hauling discarded furniture into the yard, nailing boards to windows, and cleaning rooms layered in dust. Every movement was deliberate, filled with the quiet urgency of someone who understood that the past could catch up if left unattended. Red Hollow noticed her, though the town seldom welcomed newcomers. Whispers spread through the saloon and around the wells. People spoke of the inn, of the determination in her stride, of the light in her eyes that suggested she would not be content with decay. Yet no one approached too closely. The desert had taught the residents caution, and Clara's presence was both welcome and unsettling. Daniel observed from a distance. There was something familiar in the way she worked, an intensity he recognized in himself. The inn was more than a building. It was a threshold, a place where decisions could weigh heavier than in the empty desert around them. He saw her pause at the back room, her hand lingering over the latch, and realized that she carried more than tools with her. She carried a purpose no one else in Red Hollow could see. By nightfall, the inn looked less like ruins and more like a place someone might call home. The wind had picked up, sweeping dust along the riverbed, rattling loose shutters, and sending the scent of sage and earth into the town. Clara tended the stables, feeding the horses and checking the fences, and Daniel felt the first sense of unease he had known since arriving. Red Hollow was changing, and neither he nor the town could say whether it would survive the transformation. The days that followed Clara's arrival carried a tension that threaded through Red Hollow like the wind across the mesas. She moved through the inn with unwavering focus, repairing boards, mending torn curtains, and sweeping dust from corners that had long forgotten the rhythm of human hands. Yet beneath her calm diligence there was a careful watchfulness, as if she measured every sound in the street and every shadow cast by the lanterns in the evening. Daniel noticed her attention to the stables first. She checked the latches on each stall, examined the feed, and ensured the water troughs were full. Her small bay horse followed her closely, ears twitching at every distant creak. There was a quiet intensity in her movements, a readiness that suggested she expected something to arrive, though the town had no hint what. Rumors began to stir among the townsfolk. Strangers had been known to come through Red Hollow, but none lingered like Clara. Some said she might be kin to someone long lost. Others whispered that she had left trouble behind in distant towns. Even the sheriff rode past the inn more frequently than usual, scanning the horizon and slowing to observe her work before moving on. One morning, a rider appeared on the distant trail, kicking up dust that stretched along the dry riverbed. He moved with a careful deliberation that suggested purpose rather than travel. Clara paused mid-sweep of the porch, hand resting lightly on the railing, and watched him approach. She did not flee, nor did she call out. She merely observed, as if she had been waiting. Daniel, watching from the workshop, felt a stir of recognition in her stance, a signal that the past she carried might be arriving on the horizon. By afternoon, the stranger had stopped at the edge of town. He dismounted his horse with deliberate slowness, tying it to a post while scanning the streets with sharp eyes. No one in Red Hollow approached him, though whispers followed him like shadows. Clara moved cautiously inside the inn, checking locks on doors and securing the back room she had been tending with particular care. Daniel helped without speaking, recognizing the unspoken urgency in her actions. As the sun dipped behind the mesas, the wind began to shift, carrying dust and the scent of the high desert into every corner of the town. Clara worked long into the evening, checking the stables again, inspecting each room, and pausing often to listen. Daniel realized that the inn was no longer just a place for travelers to rest. It had become a line between safety and exposure, and someone had arrived who might cross it at any moment. That night the stranger rode toward the inn under a waning moon, the quiet crunch of his horse's hooves masked by the rustle of sagebrush and the distant howl of coyotes. Daniel could not see Clara, but he sensed her presence in every measured sound, every cautious step. Red Hollow's calm had shifted, the town's fragile rhythm now intertwined with the arrival of someone who carried more than dust on his boots. By dawn, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The inn stood solid against the wind, but the town understood. Something had begun that could not be undone, and Clara, the inn, and those who had come to care for her would soon face the weight of a past that had ridden hard and was unwilling to wait.
The morning after the stranger's arrival brought a restless energy to Red Hollow. The sun climbed slowly over the mesas, burning through the thin veil of dust that clung to every surface. Clara moved through the inn with a steady hand, checking locks on doors, inspecting the stables, and counting each horse's feed with care. The back room she had guarded so closely became the center of her attention, as though its walls held secrets that might awaken at any moment. Daniel watched from the workshop, noticing how her eyes flicked constantly toward the horizon. Every sound carried meaning: the distant rattle of wagon wheels, the soft murmur of water from the creek, the scrape of a fence post settling under the sun's heat. Clara seemed to know that the stranger who had arrived carried more than news. He carried the past itself, riding hard on dusty trails that had long forgotten peace. The townsfolk began to speak in hushed tones. Horses were tied more securely, doors fastened earlier in the evening, and the sheriff's patrols stretched further into the desert. Red Hollow had endured storms and drought, bandits and lost travelers, but this felt different. Something invisible pressed against the town, and everyone who sensed it could not ignore the tension in the air. Clara spent the afternoon preparing the inn as if for siege. She reinforced the doors with heavy planks, secured the windows with nails, and inspected the back room for hidden weaknesses. She moved quietly, but with an intensity that suggested she had done this before. Daniel offered help, carrying tools and hammering boards with measured precision, but she gave no words in return, only small nods of acknowledgement. By late afternoon, the stranger appeared again, riding slowly along the dry river bed. His horse's hooves kicked up dust that settled over the town like a warning. He did not speak to anyone, did not approach the inn directly, but Daniel and Clara watched him from opposite sides of the yard, measuring the distance with careful eyes. There was no sudden danger, only the slow, deliberate tension of a coming reckoning. As the sun dipped behind the mesas, clouds rolled in low and gray, carrying the scent of rain that might never fall. The wind picked up, rattling shutters and bending the dry stalks of sage. Clara checked the stables once more, running her hands along the latches, whispering to her horses in low tones, steadying them against a storm that might be more than weather. Daniel understood then that the inn had become more than shelter. It was a watchtower, a place that marked the boundary between what could be controlled and what could not. By nightfall, the stranger had vanished again into the desert, leaving tracks that traced the edges of town and vanished into the distant hills. Clara remained vigilant, moving from room to room, listening to the quiet creaks and shifts of the building. Daniel realized that Red Hollow would not be the same again. The past had arrived with a rider, and the choices made in the next days would decide whether the town would survive the weight it had been handed or crumble beneath it. The desert wind carried a sharper bite that evening, stirring the dust into swirling ribbons across Red Hollow. Claire moved through the inn with the same deliberate care, checking every lock and latch. Yet her eyes constantly flicked toward the distant hills where the stranger had disappeared. She had fortified the building as much as she could, but the tension in the air suggested that no amount of nailed boards or heavy doors could keep what was coming at bay. Daniel worked beside her, repairing a loose window frame, his hands steady but his thoughts restless. He had never seen Clara so watchful, so attuned to every sound. Each scrape of wood, each creak of a horse tethered in the yard, each whisper of the wind along the fence posts seemed to hold a message only she could read. Daniel began to understand that the inn was no longer merely a place for the travelers to rest. It had become a shield, and Clara its sentinel. As dusk approached, the first distant thunder rolled across the mesas. The clouds hung heavy and gray, unusual for the dry season, and the wind swept low through the town, carrying the scent of rain that might or might not arrive. Horses stamped nervously in their stalls, nostrils flaring, and Clara's hands moved quickly to reassure them, patting necks and tightening ropes, murmuring in calm tones that contrasted the storm's warning. The stranger appeared once more at the edge of the dry riverbed, riding slowly into view. He did not shout or signal. His movements were measured, and his eyes scanned the town with careful scrutiny. Clara's gaze met his across the yard for a long moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Daniel felt the shift in the air, a quiet acknowledgement that the past was no longer distant, that the reckoning was imminent. Clara returned inside, moving swiftly to the back room she had prepared. She checked every corner, every surface, as though the room itself might offer protection or concealment. Daniel followed, silently helping with simple repairs, hammering boards and bracing doors under her watchful gaze. Outside, the wind rattled shutters and swept through the streets, carrying whispers of dust and secrets that had lain hidden for years. Night fell suddenly, as it often did in the desert, the sky black with clouds, stars obscured, and the mesa shadows stretching long across the town. The stranger remained at a distance, his horse pawing the ground, restless, as though aware of what awaited. Clara stayed vigilant, moving through the inn, checking stables, inspecting doors and windows, her presence a steady anchor against the uncertainty pressing from outside. By midnight, the desert held its breath. The wind howled through the gaps in the fences and past the edges of the inn, but the building remained solid. Clara's determination radiated through every plank and latch, every stable stall, every room that she had claimed as her own. Daniel realized that Red Hollow was no longer merely a town in the desert. It had become a stage, and the events that would follow would test every measure of courage, endurance, and trust that had ever been demanded by the dry, unyielding land.
The storm arrived just before dawn, rolling over the mesas like a tide of shadow and dust. Wind tore across Red Hollow with a fierce, relentless force, rattling boards and whistling through the gaps in the fences. Horses stamped in their stalls, and Clara moved among them with swift, precise movements, steadying their ropes and whispering calming words as though her voice could hold back the tempest itself. Daniel worked alongside her, bracing doors and fastening shutters, each task weighed by the knowledge that the town's fragile order depended on their efforts. The inn had become a sanctuary, a stronghold against the desert and the unseen threats that had crept closer in recent days. Outside, the wind clawed at every corner of Red Hollow, throwing dust and debris across the street. And Daniel realized the storm was as much a test of resolve as it was of endurance. The stranger remained in the shadows, riding along the riverbed, observing but not approaching. Clara caught sight of him through the back window, noting the tension in his horse, the careful way he measured every movement of the town. She knew his purpose was not malicious, yet his presence stirred the memories she had carried for years, the mistakes, the decisions, the choices that had brought her to this place. Hours passed with unbroken intensity. The wind rose higher, tearing at the roof and rattling the inn's walls. Clara moved steadily, checking each lock, each corner, each horse. She worked as if the safety of the town and the lives within it depended on her alone. Daniel marveled at her courage, realizing that she was not merely defending the inn, but creating a line that the past could not cross without consequence. By mid-morning, the storm reached its peak. Dust swirled in thick curtains, obscuring the horizon, and the sound of the wind filled every alley, street, and corner of Red Hollow. Clara's hands were steady, but her mind raced, calculating, anticipating. She moved to the back room, lifting boards and adjusting braces, reinforcing the walls, her determination unbroken despite exhaustion. Daniel helped silently, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on both their shoulders. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint, sharp scent of rain. The storm did not break fully, but it slowed enough to reveal the stranger's path. He had approached closer, moving carefully along the edge of town, but he did not enter. Clara watched, her posture firm, her eyes unwavering, knowing that what had arrived with him was not merely a presence, but a reckoning. By midday, the inn and its surroundings had survived the storm's fiercest blows. Horses were calm, doors remained latched, and the building had held its ground against the desert's fury. Clara's determination and steadfast courage had shielded not only the inn, but the fragile town of Red Hollow itself. Daniel understood then that the true test had not been the storm outside, but the one within, the ability to face the past, the unknown, and the weight of responsibility with courage that did not falter.
The days after the storm were quiet but heavy with meaning. The wind still whispered through Red Hollow, but it carried no fury, only the scent of dry earth and distant mesas. Clara moved through the inn with a calm that had not been possible before. She checked the stables, swept the porches, and inspected each room, but her movements were no longer urgent. They carried the quiet assurance of someone who had survived both the storm and the reckoning that had arrived with the stranger. Daniel watched from the workshop, repairing fence posts and mending broken boards, yet he found his thoughts drawn repeatedly to the inn. He understood now that Clara's courage had shaped the town as much as the storm or the desert ever could. The inn had become more than shelter. It was a testament to endurance, to the choices made in the face of uncertainty, and to the quiet bravery that carried a past into the present without fear. The stranger had departed, leaving only tracks that trailed toward the distant mesas. He had come seeking something, perhaps answers, perhaps closure, but he had found instead a town held together by determination and quiet vigilance. Red Hollow had remained intact, its residents unharmed, and the inn stood as proof that courage could outlast fear. Clara spent the afternoons tending to both the horses and the inn, repairing the damage the storm had caused, and smoothing the rough edges of the past that lingered in the shadows of each room. Daniel assisted without question, their partnership forged in the crucible of wind, dust, and the relentless demands of the desert. Over time, the inn became a home not just for Clara, but for the town, a place where neighbors gathered, stories were shared, and the desert's isolation felt less oppressive. Red Hollow began to notice the change. The sheriff rode past less frequently. Business owners spoke with quieter relief, and children played along the dry river bed with a sense of safety that had been absent before. The inn became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that the past, no matter how burdensome, could be faced and honored rather than feared. Clara's choice to remain, to confront what had arrived and protect those around her, had altered the town in ways no one could have predicted. By evening, the desert sky burned with gold and violet as the sun dipped behind the mesas. Clara stood on the porch, hands resting on the railing, watching the wind settle and the horses graze in the yard. Daniel joined her, and together they watched Red Hollow breathe again, calm and enduring, shaped by courage, trust, and the quiet decisions that had been made. For those who find stories of bravery, second chances, and the strength to face the past inspiring, Red Hollow and Clara's tale are only the beginning. Follow Dust and Devotion, tales to witness more journeys where the choices of the heart guide lives through storms, across mesas, and into the light of new beginnings.